The last page of the land document hit the table between them like a verdict. Belle Kendrick pressed her palm flat against the paper, her dark eyes cutting up to meet Frank Calloway's across the worn oak surface of his kitchen table, and she told herself she was not going to cry. She was not going to let the burning behind her eyes become anything more than that, because crying was not what translators did, and that was all she was here. A translator, nothing more. A woman hired to read Spanish land grants and survey records, and to render them into plain English for a cattle rancher who had no Latin education, and who needed to know whether the ground beneath his boots was legally his. She had told herself that from the very first morning, 3 weeks ago, when she stepped off the stage in Red Rock, New Mexico territory, with her leather satchel full of dictionaries and a letter of employment from the county land office. She had told herself that every single day since, every time Frank's voice softened at the dinner table, every time his hand accidentally covered hers while they both reached for the same page, every time she caught him looking at her from across the room with an expression he always looked away from before she could name it, she had told herself that right up until this moment, the last page. And now Frank Calloway was looking at her with no intention of looking away, and his voice, low and unsteady in a way she had never once heard from him in all the negotiations and confrontations she had witnessed over 3 weeks, said the thing that broke every wall she had spent those weeks building. Stay, Belle. 2 words. The simplest 2 words in the English language, and they hit her somewhere deeper than anything she had ever translated in any document in any language she knew. Frank, not as the translator, his jaw was tight. He was fighting for control of this the same way he fought for control of everything, with his hands flat on the table, with his shoulders squared, with the kind of forced stillness a man holds onto when what he really wants to do is cross a room in 3 steps. The last page is done. You've got no more reason to stay by any official arrangement. I know that. You know that. He exhaled. I'm asking you to give me a different reason. The silence between them was enormous, full of every secret they had been keeping from each other, and Belle Kendrick, who had translated the most complex legal documents the territory of New Mexico had to offer, could not find a single word of her own. That was the moment, the pivot point, the edge of everything. But to understand why that moment mattered as much as it did, you had to understand how they had arrived at it. And that story began 3 weeks earlier, on a Tuesday morning in October of 1884, on the platform of the Red Rock stage stop, when Belle Kendrick stepped down from the coach and nearly walked directly into the barrel of a Winchester rifle. She had taken the assignment because she needed the money. That was the plain truth of it, though she had dressed it up in professional language when she wrote back to the county land office in Santa Fe. She had framed it as an opportunity to expand her practice, as the development of professional relationships in the Southern Territories, as the natural next step for a woman whose translation work had quietly become indispensable to the legal community of New Mexico over the past 4 years. The real truth was simpler and considerably less dignified. Her landlord in Santa Fe had raised the rent on her rooms above the print shop. Her brother Elias owed money to people who were not patient about collecting it. And Belle had a gift, a genuine, painstaking gift that she had spent 12 years developing, for reading Spanish land grants, translating the archaic legal Spanish of the Mexican territorial period into language that American courts could process, and then explaining the findings to clients who were frequently frightened and occasionally furious. The Calloway assignment paid $40 plus room and board for the duration of the work. That was more than 3 months of rent. She had not expected the work to take her to a cattle ranch 40 miles from the nearest town of any significance. She had not expected the ranch to be beautiful in the specific way that high desert country can be beautiful, all red clay and pale grass and sky so blue it looked painted. She had not expected the client to be a man who looked like Frank Calloway. Not that she thought about that. She did not think about it at all. What she thought about When she climbed down from the stage that Tuesday morning and found herself almost face to face with a rifle, was the document tucked inside her satchel. The Calloway land grant, or rather the collection of documents that together told the contested story of who owned the 32,000 acres of Redrock Basin, was already on her mind because she had been reading summaries of it on the journey down from Santa Fe, and she had already identified what she suspected was going to be a significant problem. The man holding the rifle was not Frank Calloway. He was shorter and broader, with a rust-colored beard and the kind of eyes that assessed everything as either threat or opportunity. He lowered the weapon when he registered that she was a woman carrying a leather satchel and looking more startled than afraid. "You the translator," he said. "I am," Belle said. "Belle Kendrick. I have a letter from the county land office." The man with the rifle, who introduced himself as Dutch Varner and who turned out to be the foreman of the competing claim, the Varner operation that sat on the western edge of the same basin, looked at her letter and then looked at her with an expression that was considerably more complicated than the document warranted. "You're working for Calloway," he said. It was not entirely a question. "I was contracted by the county land office to provide translation services," Belle said carefully. "The documents I'll be working with relate to the Calloway claim, yes." Dutch Varner handed the letter back. "You should know," he said, "that this territory has a long memory. Things that happened in this basin go back 30 years. You start translating those old papers, you're going to find things that cut more than one direction." Belle tucked the letter back in her satchel. "That's generally how legal history works, Mr. Varner." He held her gaze for a moment longer than was comfortable, and then he stepped back from the platform and let her pass. She walked toward the two horses and the man standing beside them, and that was when she met Frank Calloway for the first time. He was taller than Dutch Varner by several inches, lean in the way men get when they do physical work every day of their lives, with dark brown hair that needed cutting and eyes the color of the sage that grew in the arroyos, a gray-green that changed with the light. He was 32 years old, as she would later learn, which put them within 3 years of each other, and he carried himself with the particular combination of confidence and wariness that Belle had learned to recognize in men who had been tested repeatedly by hard circumstances, and who had, each time, come out the other side intact but not unscathed. He looked at Dutch Varner's retreating back, and then he looked at Belle. "He give you any trouble?" Frank said. "He gave me a warning," Belle said, "which is not quite the same thing." Something shifted in Frank Calloway's expression, something that was almost approval but was being held back from becoming that. "I'm Frank Calloway," he said. "You're Miss Kendrick." "Belle," she said, because she had always found formality inefficient. "If we're going to be working through those documents together, you may as well use my name." He held the horse steady while she mounted, and the ride out to the ranch took 40 minutes through country that grew more dramatic with every mile, the red cliffs rising on the eastern horizon, the basin opening below them like a cupped hand. Frank did not talk much on the ride, which she noted without interpreting. Some people were quiet because they had nothing to say. Others were quiet because they were thinking more carefully than conversation allowed. She was already suspecting he was the second kind. The ranch house was larger than she expected, built solidly of adobe with a wide covered porch, and a kitchen that smelled of coffee and pine smoke. A woman named Lucia, who managed the household and who had been with the Calloway family for 11 years, showed Belle to a room at the back of the house with a window that faced east and a desk large enough to work at comfortably. The documents were already waiting for her. 3 separate wooden boxes, each one stamped with the seal of the county land office. Belle sat down at the desk that first evening, opened the first box, and began to read. By midnight she knew that Dutch Varner had been right. This was going to cut more than one direction. The documents told a story that went back to 1852, to an original land grant issued by the Mexican government to a man named Rodrigo Gallegos, who had ranched the basin for 17 years before the American acquisition of the territory. After the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, the legal status of Mexican land grants became enormously complicated, and the Gallegos' claim was no exception. There were surveys, counter-surveys, boundary disputes, a period of abandonment in 1861, during which two separate parties had moved onto different sections of the basin, and then a confusing cascade of subsequent purchases, quitclaims, and court proceedings that had never been fully resolved. Frank Calloway's father had purchased the eastern section of the basin in 1863 from the Gallegos' estate. He had built the ranch, raised his family on it, and died on it in 1879. Frank had inherited it at 27, had run it for 5 years, and now the county was requiring a full legal documentation of title before it would register the land in Frank's name outright. The problem, which Belle had identified in general terms before she arrived, and in specific terms now that she had the actual documents in front of her, was this. The original Gallegos grant described boundaries using landmarks, the way all Mexican land grants of that period did, and two of those landmarks, a dry creek bed called the Arroyo de las Almas and a stone formation called the Tres Piedras, had been interpreted differently by the two subsequent purchases. Frank Calloway's father had bought the land using one interpretation. The Varner family, who had bought the western section in 1871, had used a different interpretation. The overlap between the two interpretations covered approximately 4,000 acres of the most water-rich land in the basin. 4,000 acres. In ranch country, in 1884, with cattle prices the way they were, that was not just a legal dispute. That was the difference between a profitable operation and a struggling one. It was the difference between holding on and letting go. It was the kind of dispute that had started range wars in this territory and in every territory like it. Belle sat back in her chair and pressed her fingers against her eyes and thought, very carefully, about what she was going to tell Frank Calloway in the morning. She told him plainly. That was her way, had always been her way, because she had grown up watching what happened when the truth was softened past recognition, had watched her father soften truths until they became comfortable fictions that eventually collapsed under their own dishonesty. And she had decided somewhere around age 14 that she would always prefer the accurate version even when it was inconvenient. Frank listened to her whole explanation without interrupting, sitting across from her at the kitchen table with his coffee growing cold beside him, and his hands folded together in a way that suggested very controlled tension. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. "So you're telling me there's 4,000 acres of my ranch that might legally belong to Varner," he said. "I'm telling you the documents are ambiguous," Belle said. "I'm also telling you that there are arguments in your favor, strong ones, based on the 1867 survey and on the continuous use doctrine. But I would be doing you a disservice if I didn't tell you the full picture." Frank looked at her steadily. "Has anyone ever told you that you're very direct for a—" He stopped himself. "For a woman," Belle finished. "I was going to say for a lawyer," Frank said, "but I take your point." The slight humor in his voice surprised her. She had expected defensiveness or dismissal or the particular flavor of masculine frustration that she had encountered regularly in her professional life when the news she delivered was not what her clients wanted to hear. She had not expected the self-correction or the willingness to catch himself. She noted it, filed it somewhere useful. "I'm not a lawyer," she said. "I'm a translator, but the translation suggests you need one." "I can't afford a lawyer," Frank said, "if the translation goes the way you're describing. If the claim is contested and I lose the water right acres, this ranch operates at a loss." He said it without self-pity, which she respected. Just the arithmetic of the situation stated clearly. "Then we need to make sure the translation is thorough enough that you have every possible argument available," Belle said. "I can't tell you which way a court will decide, but I can make sure nothing is missed in the documents." Frank looked at her for a moment. "How long will that take?" 2 weeks, she said. "Possibly 3. The first week established the pattern of their days." Belle worked at the desk in her room in the mornings, reading through documents and making notes. In the afternoons, she would spread the most important papers on the kitchen table, and Frank would sit across from her, and they would go through her findings together, because he needed to understand what the documents said, not just what her summary told him. She had never had a client who engaged with the documents themselves the way Frank did. Most of her clients were content to receive summaries. Frank wanted to understand the structure of the arguments, the logic of the Spanish legal tradition, the specific way that Mexican land grants had been administered and recorded, and why that mattered for his case. He asked good questions. He remembered everything she told him. He pushed back when her reasoning moved too fast, not argumentatively, but with the precision of a man who knew that understanding the foundation mattered as much as the conclusion. It forced her to be better at her work, which was not something many clients had ever managed. In the evenings, they ate dinner with Lucia at the long table in the kitchen, and occasionally with two of the ranch hands, a young man named Tomás who had grown up on the property, and an older man named Chester who had worked cattle since before Frank was born. The conversation ranged from ranch business to the news that came in with the weekly supply run, and Belle found herself included in it naturally, without the slight awkwardness of being a guest that she normally experienced in professional arrangements. She was careful about that comfort. She noticed it and watched it the way you watch whether you do not fully trust. The hidden motive she had identified in the documents, the thing she had not yet told Frank about because she needed to understand it better before she brought it to him, was this: there was a third party in the chain of title. Buried in a set of documents from 1860, the year before the abandonment period, there was a transfer from the original Gallegos estate to a man named William Kendrick, her father. Belle had recognized the name the second night, at 2 in the morning, pulling a document from the bottom of the second wooden box, and she had sat absolutely still for 4 minutes before she was able to continue reading. Her hands had not shaken, because she had trained herself out of letting her hands shake years ago. But something inside her had gone very quiet in the specific way things go quiet when the past arrives somewhere you were not expecting it. Her father, William Kendrick, had been a land speculator. That was the polite word. He had moved through New Mexico and Arizona territory in the 1850s and 1860s, buying and selling land claims of uncertain legal status, exploiting the confusion of the post-treaty period to acquire properties cheaply and sell them at profit. He had been charming and intelligent and completely without ethical compass, and Belle had spent her adult life building a professional reputation that was the precise opposite of everything he stood for, characterized by scrupulous accuracy, absolute honesty, and the fierce protection of the clients who trusted her work. The document from 1860 suggested that William Kendrick had purchased a portion of the Gallegos grant and subsequently sold it to a third party. The third party appeared to have then sold it to the man who eventually became the eastern section purchaser, the Calloway family, which meant that Belle's father was a link in the chain of title of the very property she had been hired to document. She did not know yet whether this constituted a conflict of interest. She did not know yet whether it affected the strength of Frank's claim. She did not know whether there were additional documents that clarified the transaction or complicated it further. She needed to understand the full picture before she brought it to Frank, because bringing him incomplete information about something this important would be irresponsible. That was what she told herself. She was also, in the small hours of the third morning, trying very hard not to think about the possibility that there was a darker version of this story, one in which her father's involvement was not merely a historical footnote, but an active element of whatever dispute Dutch Varner was planning to use against Frank's claim. Because Dutch Varner had looked at her on the stage platform with the expression of a man who knew something she did not yet know, and that expression had not left her. On the 8th day, she found the document that changed everything. It was a letter, handwritten in a combination of Spanish and English, tucked inside the lining of the third wooden box. Someone had slipped it between the lining and the wood deliberately, carefully, in a way that suggested it was being hidden rather than stored. The date on the letter was June 4, 1861. It was from William Kendrick to a man named Harold Varner, Dutch's father. Belle read it twice, then a third time, translating the Spanish passages in her head with the automatic precision of long practice, and when she finished the third reading she folded the letter, sat with it in her hands for a full minute, and then went and found Frank. He was in the barn, working on a section of fence that had come loose from its post. He looked up when she came in, registered something in her expression immediately, and set down the tool in his hand. "What did you find?" he said. Belle unfolded the letter and held it out to him. "I need to tell you everything," she said, "including the part that's complicated for me personally." She watched him read it, watched his brow compress as he worked through the English portions, and waited while she translated the Spanish, and she told him about her father. All of it. The land speculation, the transactions of the 1850s and 1860s, the discovery of the Kendrick name in the chain of title, and then this letter, which appeared to be evidence that William Kendrick and Harold Varner had conspired to misrepresent the boundary of the land they were each buying, deliberately creating the ambiguity that now threatened Frank's title. Frank was very quiet when she finished. The afternoon light came through the gaps in the barn siding in long pale bars, and dust moved slowly through the air between them, and he was quiet for long enough that Belle became aware of her own breathing. "Your father created this problem," Frank said finally. "Not an accusation, an assessment." "It appears so," Belle said. "And I need to tell you that when I was hired for this assignment, I had no knowledge of his involvement. I never would have accepted the assignment if I had known. I want you to have the freedom to. I don't want a different translator," Frank said. She stopped. "You found the letter," he said. "You could have not told me. You could have filed it quietly, or left it in the lining of that box, or translated around it. You told me the truth instead." He held her gaze with those gray-green eyes that changed with the light. "That tells me exactly what kind of person you are, and that's the kind of person I want working on this." The trust in that statement did something significant to Belle's internal architecture. She filed the sensation away and did not examine it directly. "The letter is potentially very valuable," she said, refocusing on the professional matter because the professional matter was safer. "It suggests that the ambiguity in the boundary description was intentional, created by two parties acting in bad faith. If that can be established, it significantly strengthens your position, because courts have consistently held that a manufactured ambiguity cannot be used to benefit the party who manufactured it. Varner's claim would be tainted by his father's fraud." "And your father's fraud," Frank said. "And my father's fraud," Belle said. "Yes." They stood together in the barn for another moment, and then Frank picked up his tool again, and then he set it down again, and then he said something she was not expecting. "Your father was a difficult man." The question arrived quietly and without pressure, and Belle felt the honesty of it, the genuine curiosity behind it, and she answered before she could decide not to. "He was charming," she said. "That was the difficulty. It was very hard to see what he actually was until you stepped back far enough to see the pattern, and by then a lot of people had been hurt by it." Frank nodded slowly. "My father was not charming," he said. "He was just absent, not in the sense of being gone. In the sense of being present in the same room and entirely unreachable." He looked at the fence post. "Different problem, same result." Belle looked at him and understood, in the sudden complete way that understanding sometimes arrives, that this man had spent his adult life building something solid and honest precisely because he had grown up with a model of the opposite. The ranch was not just a livelihood. It was a statement. It was the physical embodiment of Frank Calloway's determination to be the kind of person neither his absent father nor the wild, predatory economics of the territory had encouraged him to be. She was very careful after that about how much time she spent looking at him. The second week brought the Varner confrontation. Dutch Varner rode onto the ranch property on a Wednesday afternoon, with two men behind him, and the comfortable demeanor of someone who believes he holds all the important cards. Belle was sitting on the porch, working through a survey document when the horses came up the road, and she was aware of Frank behind her, having come around the side of the house from wherever he had been working, standing with his hands at his sides and his posture carrying the particular calibrated stillness that she was beginning to recognize as his version of a warning. "Calloway," Dutch said from horseback, "I hear your translator has been making real progress." "She has," Frank said. Dutch looked at Belle with the same complicated assessment he had shown on the stage platform. "I also hear she found some old letters in those land office boxes." Something cold moved through Belle's chest. The letter. Dutch knew about the letter, or knew something enough to probe, which meant either someone at the county land office had told him what the boxes contained, or he had other sources of information about his father's history with William Kendrick, or both. "Everything I find in the course of my work is part of the official record," Belle said, keeping her voice level. "That's standard procedure." "Sure it is," Dutch said pleasantly. "Course, some things in those boxes might be real inconvenient for more than one party. My understanding is you've got a personal connection to some of what's in there, Miss Kendrick." This was the trap. Belle saw it clearly. Dutch wanted her to be defensive about her father's involvement, wanted her to feel compromised and behave compromised, wanted to be able to argue later that her translation work was tainted by personal interest. He had probably been planning this since the stage platform. Possibly since before she was hired. "My professional standards do not have exceptions," Belle said. "Everything I find will be documented accurately and reported to the county land office, including anything that reflects on any party's conduct, past or present." The pleasantness in Dutch's expression did not change, but something behind his eyes shifted. She had answered the right way, and he had registered it. Frank stepped down from the porch. He did not raise his voice, did not reach for the rifle leaning against the door frame. He just walked to the edge of the porch step and stopped, and the sheer physical fact of him, the way he occupied space with complete certainty, carried its own communication. "You've said what you came to say," Frank said to Dutch. "We're done." Dutch held the standoff for a beat, then smiled and reined his horse around. "See you at the county office, Calloway," he said. "When we get to the hearing." The three riders went back down the road. Belle let out a breath she had been holding for 2 minutes and set her survey document on the porch railing. "He knows about my father's letter," she said. "I heard," Frank said. "Does it change what you can do with it legally?" "No," she said. "It only matters if it changes what I'm willing to do, and it doesn't." Frank looked at her for a moment, standing on the step, and the afternoon light hit him at an angle that did something to the lines of his face, softened the tension in his jaw, and Belle looked away first, which was something she rarely did. "Come inside," Frank said. "Lucia made empanadas. We can look at the survey boundaries while we eat." The empanadas were excellent, and the boundary analysis took 2 hours, and at the end of the 2 hours they had identified 3 additional surveyors' marks that, if they could be physically located on the land itself, would support the interpretation that placed the water right acres inside the Calloway claim. Frank proposed that they ride out to look for the marks the following morning. Belle agreed. The ride the next morning was where the professional arrangement began its quiet, persistent slide into something neither of them was naming. They rode east at first light, before the heat built, following the trace of what the survey documents described as the original line of the Arroyo de las Almas. The light in the early morning was extraordinary, that particular quality of high desert light in October that made everything look slightly more vivid than real life, and Belle was aware of riding alongside Frank at an easy pace through country that was wild and beautiful and completely removed from every context in which she normally spent her days. She had been to beautiful places in her professional life. She had sat in offices and courthouses and ranches all across New Mexico territory, and some of those places had been visually remarkable. This was different, and she suspected the difference had something to do with the man riding beside her, though she was not prepared to examine that suspicion closely. They found the first surveyor's mark at mid-morning, a sandstone stake set in a cairn of smaller rocks at the base of a red cliff formation. It was weathered but intact, and the inscription on it matched the description in the 1867 survey document exactly. Frank dismounted and crouched beside it, and Belle read him the relevant passage from the document she had brought, and they looked at each other across the sandstone stake with something that was clearly mutual satisfaction, but was carrying more than that underneath it. "One down," Frank said. "Two to go," Belle said. They did not find the second mark that day. They ate a late lunch in the shade of an overhanging rock, Lucia's corn tortillas and salted beef, and they talked, genuinely talked, in a way that went sideways from the professional purpose, and neither of them fully corrected it. Belle told him about learning Spanish from a woman named Dona Alejandra, who had run a household in Albuquerque, and who had taken on the translation of a Mexican land grant as a sort of hobby project, and had found, halfway through, that she actually needed professional help. Frank told her about the first cattle drive he had run after his father died, 27 years old and responsible for a herd and 4 hands, and a route he had never traveled, and how he had made 3 significant mistakes, and learned from each of them, and come home with the cattle sold and the money in his pocket, and the absolute conviction that he could do this. "That conviction sounds like it costs something," Belle said. "It cost 2 years of sleeping badly," Frank said. "But it was worth it." She laughed. The laugh surprised her slightly, came up before she had organized it, and Frank watched her laugh with an expression she was very firmly not interpreting. They found the second surveyor's mark on the 3rd day of searching, on a morning after a light rain had cleared the air to extraordinary clarity, and they found it in a small canyon that required dismounting and leading the horses single file through a narrow passage. Belle's mare, unaccustomed to the canyon walls, shied sideways, and Frank caught Belle's arm as she stumbled, and for several seconds they were simply standing close together in a canyon with the sound of distant water and his hand on her arm and the absolute uselessness of professional distance. He released her carefully. She thanked him. They found the mark 20 feet further on, and both of them were considerably more reserved for the next hour, which was itself a kind of communication. The third mark was the critical one. The documents described it as the Tres Piedras Formation, 3 distinctive red sandstone pillars visible from a distance, and if the third mark confirmed the 1867 survey interpretation, it would anchor the entire argument for the water right acres belonging to the Calloway claim. They found it on the 5th day of searching, and it was exactly where the 1867 survey said it should be, which placed it squarely inside the area described by the Calloway purchase and outside the area described by the Varner purchase. Belle read the coordinates from the document, compared them to the physical location with the care and precision that had always characterized her best work, and confirmed the finding twice before she said it aloud. "This supports your claim," she said, unambiguously, combined with the letter documenting the fraudulent intent behind the boundary ambiguity, and with these 3 physical survey markers, your legal position is strong. Frank was quiet for a moment, standing beside the 3 red pillars in the afternoon light. Belle could see what the confirmation meant to him, could see the relief working through his face in the slow, controlled way he processed strong feeling. "You did this," he said. "The documents did it," Belle said. "I only translated." "Don't do that," Frank said. He turned to look at her with a directness that she felt in her sternum. "You could have filed a standard summary report and been done in a week. You went into every corner of every document. You found the letter. You came out here for 5 days riding through canyon country looking for a 300-year-old surveyor's stake. You gave this everything." He paused. "Don't translate that into something smaller than it is." The Tres Piedras cast long shadows in the late afternoon. Belle stood in the silence his words created and felt, somewhere behind her professional composure, something shift. Something she had been holding steady for 2.5 weeks began to come loose, very slightly at the edges. "We should start back," she said. They rode back in the early evening light, the sky going gold and then rose and then the deep clear blue that precedes dark in the high desert, and they did not talk much, and the silence between them was no longer the silence of professional distance. It was something else entirely. That night, sitting at dinner, Frank told Lucia that they had found all 3 markers, and Lucia crossed herself and said a prayer in Spanish that Belle translated automatically, and did not share with Frank because it was about more than the land claim. Lucia had been watching them for 2.5 weeks with the patience and attentiveness of someone who had managed a household long enough to understand what she was watching. Belle worked through the final week with the knowledge that the assignment was nearly complete. She compiled her findings into a formal report, organized the physical evidence, annotated the letter from William Kendrick and Harold Varner with careful professional analysis, and prepared a summary document that could be presented to the county land office and, if necessary, to a territorial court. She worked very hard during that final week and tried not to think about what came after it. The evening before the last day, Frank found her on the porch at dusk, sitting with the completed report in her lap, looking out at the red cliffs going dark against the sky. He sat in the other chair, the one that had somehow become his chair over the course of their evenings, and he handed her a cup of coffee, and for a few minutes they watched the light change without speaking. "You leave the day after tomorrow," Frank said. It was not a question. "The stage comes through Raydrock on Thursday," Belle said. "I'll need to be in town by morning." "You could take one of the horses," Frank said. "Easier than walking the 40 miles. "I wasn't planning to walk," Belle said. She meant it lightly, but it came out something close to sad, and she heard that in her own voice and did not like it. Belle. Her name in his voice, she had noticed this, always sounded slightly different from the way other people said it, as if he had been careful about it from the first time he used it. "Frank," she said, in something close to warning. "I know what you're going to say," he said. "Then I won't say it. You are going to say that this has been a professional arrangement and that you've conducted yourself accordingly and that the most sensible thing is to take the horse on Thursday morning and go back to Santa Fe and file your report, and that's the end of it." Belle looked at the darkening sky. "That's a very accurate summary." "It is," Frank said. "It's also incomplete." She did not answer. "You know it's incomplete," he said, quiet, not pushing, just stating what was true. "What I know," Belle said carefully, "is that my professional life is in Santa Fe and this ranch is 40 miles from anywhere, and you need to focus on the county hearing, and nothing practical points toward anything other than Thursday." "I didn't ask about practical," Frank said. She looked at him then, which was what he had been waiting for. "What do you want me to say, Frank?" "The truth," he said. "You're very good at that." The evening birds had started their dusk chorus in the desert, and somewhere down by the barn one of the horses shifted and blew out a breath, and Belle Kendrick sat with the truth in her chest and decided that for once she was not going to make it smaller than it was. "I think I would like very much to stay," she said. "That's the truth. I also think I'm frightened of what that means." Frank was quiet for a moment. "What are you frightened of?" "I'm frightened of making a decision based on something beautiful," she said, "and finding out later that it was a trap I walked into with my eyes open because I wanted to. I spent my whole childhood watching someone who was very good at making traps look like gifts. It makes a person cautious." Frank set his coffee cup down. He leaned forward with his elbows on his knees, and the posture was so unlike his usual carefully maintained stillness that it told her something important about how much of himself he was putting into this moment. "I have never once tried to make anything look like what it isn't," he said. "You've been in this house for 3 weeks, and you've seen me lose my temper with Chester over the fence line, and you've seen me sit with bad financial news without flinching, and you've seen me ride out to find a stone marker in a canyon because the honest thing was to look. None of that was arranged for your benefit. It was just how I am." He looked at her steadily. "I'm not your father, and this is not a trap." The directness of it moved through her completely. Belle sat with it, tested it the way she tested everything, looked at it from different angles and found that it held. "I know," she said. "That's partly what frightens me." Frank made a sound that was almost a laugh. "The fact that I'm honest frightens you. The fact that you're honest makes me want things I'm not sure I'm prepared to want," she said, "which is considerably more frightening." They sat with that for a while, as the sky went fully dark and the stars began to appear over the red cliffs, more stars than Belle ever saw in Santa Fe, extravagant in the clear desert air. And she thought about Thursday and about Santa Fe and about $40 and her brother's debt and her landlord's rent. And she also thought about what it felt like to ride out in the early morning in this country, and what it felt like to find a 300-year-old surveyor's stake and look up into gray-green eyes that saw exactly what she had done and refused to let her reduce it. "Go to sleep," Frank said eventually. "Last day tomorrow. Let's finish it right." She did. She went inside and finished the last of the report by lamplight, and went to sleep and woke before dawn, and sat at the desk in the east-facing room, watching the light come up over the red cliffs, which was something she had started doing in the second week, and had not stopped doing because it was one of the finest things she had seen in her life, and she did not know if she was preparing to leave it or to stay with it. And the not knowing was the most honest she had been with herself about this since the moment she arrived, the final day. They spread the documents on the kitchen table in the morning, the same way they had done every day of the assignment, and Belle walked Frank through the completed report. She explained the structure of the argument, the supporting documents, the significance of the physical survey markers, and the analysis of the Kendrick-Varner letter. She was thorough and precise. This was her best work, and she knew it, and she wanted Frank to have it in full. Frank listened and asked questions and made notes, and they went through it all, every page, every document, every annotation, and then they came to the last page. And Belle pressed her palm flat against it and looked up and said, "That's everything." And Frank said, "Stay, Belle." And now she was sitting in the silence those words created, and she was not crying, and she was looking at him across the table with all the professional distance she had spent 3 weeks building, dissolving like paper in rain. "Not as the translator," he said. "The last page is done. You've got no more reason to stay by any official arrangement. I know that, you know that." He exhaled. "I'm asking you to give me a different reason." "Frank," she said, "this is a very complicated moment." "I know it is," he said. "Ask me anything you want to know. Ask me anything you're unsure about. I'm not asking you to decide right now. I'm asking you not to be on that stage tomorrow morning." He paused. "Stay for a week. Give us a week that isn't about the documents. And then if you want to go to Santa Fe, I'll ride you to the station myself." Belle looked at the last page of her report, at her own handwriting covering it in careful, precise lines, at the work she had done here at this table in this house in those canyons. "A week," she said. "A week," Frank said. She looked up at him. "If I stay a week, it won't resolve anything." "It might," he said, "or it might resolve everything." He had gone still in the way he went still when he was entirely certain, and Belle recognized that stillness and what it meant. "All right," she said. She stayed the week. The county land office hearing was scheduled for 3 weeks out, which meant the documents needed to go to Redrock by Friday, which Frank handled by sending Chester to town with the sealed report on Thursday morning. Belle watched Chester ride out with her work in his saddlebag and felt the strange lightness of a completed thing. Then she turned around and walked back into a house she was in for no professional reason at all, and Frank was standing in the kitchen making coffee with his back to her, and he turned when he heard her come in and he smiled, which was not something he did often, and it changed his whole face. "Chester's gone," she said. "I know," Frank said. "So are the documents." He held out a cup of coffee. "No more excuses." "I wasn't using them as excuses," Belle said. She took the cup. "I was using them as a reasonable structural framework for the appropriate behavior of a professional woman in a professional context." "That's the most words you've ever used to agree with me," Frank said. She sat at the kitchen table, the table that was completely clear of documents for the first time since she arrived, and looked at the empty surface. "What do we do now?" she said. "Lucia's planning to ride into Redrock herself tomorrow," Frank said. "She wants to see her sister. She'll be gone 3 or 4 days." "That's a very significant fact to offer as a conversational opening," Belle said. Frank sat down across from her. "I didn't mean it the way it sounds. Lucia's been planning the trip for a month." He looked directly at her. "I just want you to know that we'll have the run of the house. That there's no reason we need to spend the next 7 days working or translating or being useful. We can just be." Belle considered this. "I'm not sure I know how to just be." "Neither do I," Frank said. "I think that might be interesting to find out." The next 4 days were, in Belle's subsequent private accounting, among the most disorienting and joyful days of her life. She discovered that Frank could cook, imperfectly but enthusiastically, a fact he had kept concealed during the weeks when Lucia managed the kitchen. He made a beef stew on the first evening of Lucia's absence that was genuinely excellent, and she told him so, and he looked so pleased with himself that she had to look away to keep from saying something she was not ready to say. They rode out on the second day not to find surveyor's marks, but simply to ride, following the arroyo north to where it opened into a broader valley that Belle had not seen in her working explorations of the property. Frank knew the land in the way a man knows something he has walked over for 30 years, with an intuitive bodily knowledge that had nothing to do with surveys or documents, and he showed her things. A seasonal spring where the water still ran clear in October, a cluster of petroglyphs on a north-facing cliff that he said were Pueblo in origin, and several 100 years old, a place where the grass grew thick and green in an otherwise dry landscape, because an underground channel ran beneath it. She stood at the spring in the afternoon light, listening to water move, and Frank stood beside her, and the silence between them was the kind that only exists between people who have moved past the place where silence is uncomfortable. "My father never showed this to anyone," Frank said. "He just owned it. There's a difference." "Yes," Belle said. "I want to share it," he said. He was not looking at her when he said it, looking at the spring. "Not just with ranch hands and surveyors. With someone who sees it." "I see it," she said, very quiet. He looked at her then, and the gray-green of his eyes in the afternoon desert light was the color of sage after rain. "I know you do," he said. He did not kiss her that day at the spring, though she was aware, in the way you become aware of things you have been carefully not acknowledging, that the possibility of it had been present between them for much longer than she had been admitting. He kissed her on the third day on the porch in the early morning, when they were both standing watching the light come up over the red cliffs, which had become something they did together rather than separately. And when the light reached the particular moment that made the cliffs look like they were glowing from inside, Belle said quietly, "It does that every morning. Every single morning." "Every single morning," Frank agreed. And then he turned to her, and she turned to him at exactly the same moment, and when he kissed her, it was with the same quality that characterized everything else about him, deliberate and honest, and without any pretense of being casual about something that was not casual at all. She kissed him back, because she had always been very bad at pretending something was smaller than it was. On the 5th day of her supposed 1-week extension, Dutch Varner came back. He rode up in the afternoon, alone this time, without the 2 men who had accompanied him before, and there was something different about him. The pleasantness that had served as a container for his hostility was gone. He looked like a man who had received news he had not been prepared for. Frank came out on the porch. Belle stood beside him. "The county land office received your report," Dutch said. He was looking at Belle. "My lawyer has reviewed it. The Tres Piedras marks." He stopped. "And the letter?" Belle said nothing. Frank said nothing. "My father," Dutch started and then stopped again. He took his hat off and ran a hand through his hair in a gesture that was so much less controlled than his usual manner that Belle registered it as genuine. "What my father did was not anything I knew about. I want you to know that." Belle studied him. She had spent a professional lifetime reading people, and she was looking at Dutch Varner now with every instrument she had, and she believed him. The betrayal on his face was real. He had built his claim on ground he thought was solid, and now he had found out the ground itself was fraudulent, and the discovery was doing something complicated to him. "I don't doubt that, Mr. Varner," she said. Dutch looked at Frank. "My claim on the Waterright acres was based on what my father told me was legal fact. He never mentioned the arrangement with your father." He put his hat back on. "I'm going to withdraw the contest before the hearing." Frank was very still. "Why are you telling me this in person?" Dutch was quiet for a moment. "Because this basin was big enough for 2 operations before all this started. I'd like it to be big enough for 2 operations after." He looked at Frank. "My western acres are good grazing land. I just need the water access, and there's another way to get it that doesn't involve contested ground. I'd rather spend the next 30 years as your neighbor than your enemy." Frank was quiet for a long moment, and Belle felt the weight of the decision he was making, not just about the hearing but about what kind of man he was going to be about this. "Come inside," Frank said. "Let's talk about water access." They talked for 2 hours, Belle translating the relevant documents at Dutch's request when the boundary descriptions became relevant. And what came out of those 2 hours was the beginning of a water-sharing arrangement that Frank's lawyer would need to formalize, but which Dutch and Frank shook hands over at the kitchen table in the late afternoon, and which represented more than a legal agreement. It represented a decision by both men to choose the version of this story that was not a range war. After Dutch rode away, Frank stood on the porch and looked out at the cliffs that were going their extraordinary late afternoon gold, and Belle stood beside him, and after a while he said, "He's right that the basin is big enough." "He is," Belle said. "My father would have pursued it to the last acre," Frank said, "just to win." "I know," Belle said, "but you're not your father." He turned and looked at her, and the expression on his face was the same one she had seen the day she confessed her father's involvement in the documents, the same clear-eyed recognition, the same refusal to reduce the truth of a thing. "Neither are you," he said. She leaned into him, which was not something she had done before, and he put his arm around her, which was not something he had done before, and they stood together watching the cliffs go gold and then rose and then the particular purple-gray of desert dusk. "Your week is almost up," Frank said. "I know," Belle said. "Do you want more time?" He said it carefully, fully prepared to give it if that was what she needed. Belle thought about Santa Fe. She thought about her rooms above the print shop, and the rent that was due, and her brother Elia's, and the Latin dictionaries on her desk, and the letters of inquiry from clients she had not yet answered. She thought about the professional life she had built with such discipline over such a long time, the life that was entirely hers in a period when women's lives were rarely entirely their own. Then she thought about a spring in an October canyon and the color of light on red cliffs and a man who did not try to make things look like what they were not. "I don't want more time," she said. "I want to make a decision." He waited. "I want to stay," she said. "Not for a week. I want to stay." She turned to look at him. "But I need you to understand what that means. My work matters to me. The translation practice, the professional life. I'm not going to put that in a box and set it on a shelf because I moved to a ranch." "I wouldn't ask you to," Frank said, with the quiet certainty of a man who had thought about this. "You'd need a room in the house that's a proper office," Belle said, "with enough space for the reference materials I'd need to bring from Santa Fe. And I'd need to travel occasionally to Santa Fe and Albuquerque for cases that require it." "The east-facing room is yours," Frank said. "It's had your things in it for 3 weeks already, and I can get you to the stage when you need to travel. And I need to deal with my brother's situation," she said, "which is complicated and not resolved." "Tell me about it," Frank said. "All of it, let me help." She told him. About Elia's, about the debts, about the men in Santa Fe who were not patient about collecting, about the way Belle had been quietly sending money north to keep the situation from becoming worse while trying to build enough of her own savings to actually solve it. Frank listened to the whole story, and then he was quiet for a while, and then he said, "How much?" she told him. It was a substantial sum by any measure, and she watched his face to see whether it would change anything, whether the arithmetic would rewrite the expression he wore when he looked at her. It didn't. "I can lend it to him," Frank said. "Proper terms, written agreement, because I'm not in the habit of informal arrangements, but I can do it." Belle felt something in her chest that she did not have a professional word for. "Frank, you have spent 3 weeks ensuring that I can hold this ranch," he said. "The work you did, the markers you found, the letter you brought to me when it would have been easier not to. This ranch is standing because of that." He held her gaze. "Helping you stand is not a sacrifice. It's an obligation. And I mean it with everything I have." She looked at him for a long moment in the purple-gray dusk. Then she reached up and put her hand against his jaw, which startled him slightly and which she found she did not want to stop doing. "All right," she said. "Then I'm staying." The 2 weeks that followed were the business of transition, which was its own kind of adventure. Belle wrote to her landlord in Santa Fe, formal and polite, giving sufficient notice. She wrote to the county land office with a change of correspondence address. She wrote to 2 clients whose cases were ongoing with updates that indicated a brief delay, while she managed a relocation. She wrote to Elias carefully, explaining that she had arranged for his debt to be addressed, and that he was to present himself to a lawyer in Santa Fe whose name she would provide, and that the time for informal arrangements was finished. She did not write to Elias about Frank. That conversation needed to happen in person. Frank rode with her to Santa Fe in November to collect her belongings. It was a 3-day journey each way, and they stayed at inns both nights of each leg. And it was during those hours of travel and the long evenings of conversation that Belle understood, in a full and settled way, the scope of what she was beginning. Not the ranch and the legal situation and the county hearing, which was now proceeding smoothly toward a favorable outcome, but this. Frank Calloway, who had taught himself silence because the alternative was too much noise, who had built something lasting and honest on ground that was his because he had worked for it and defended it, who had asked her to stay after the last page not because he needed a translator, but because he had been paying attention and seen something real. Lucia welcomed Belle's return with considerably more warmth than a housekeeper is professionally obligated to display, which communicated something about Lucia's assessment of the situation that Belle found touching. Tomas, the young ranch hand, helped carry Belle's boxes inside with the cheerful helpfulness of someone who has been told good news and is glad of it. Chester made no comment, but he rearranged the barn schedule so that the gentler mare was consistently available for Belle's use, which was its own kind of statement. The county land office hearing took place in December, in Reed Rock, in a room that smelled of wood smoke and tobacco, and the dusty particular smell of legal proceedings conducted in small frontier towns. Belle sat behind Frank, who sat beside his lawyer, a pragmatic man named Addison who had been practicing in the territory for 20 years, and who had read Belle's report with the kind of appreciation that professionals show for exceptionally good work. Dutch Varner sat across the room with his own lawyer. He did not contest the Calloway claim on the Waterright acres. When the hearing officer asked him to confirm, he confirmed, in a voice that was quieter than his stage platform voice had been, that he was withdrawing the contest on the grounds that the basis for the claim was the product of fraud by parties no longer living. The hearing officer reviewed Belle's report, asked Addison several questions about the physical survey markers, reviewed the Kendrick-Varner letter with careful attention, and then looked up and said that the Calloway claim was confirmed. Frank was very still when it happened. Belle put her hand on his shoulder from behind briefly and felt the tension release from his body in a single long exhale. Outside the courthouse, in the December air, Dutch Varner came to them. He and Frank shook hands. Belle watched the 2 men look at each other across the contested history of the basin and choose the forward version of it. "Good hearing," Dutch said. "Good outcome," Frank said. "I'll have my lawyer draw up the water access agreement next week." Dutch nodded. He looked at Belle. "You did the right thing," he said. With the letter, you could have buried it. No, Belle said simply. I could not have. He nodded again and walked to his horse, and Frank put his hand at the small of Belle's back, which was not a grand gesture but was the gesture of a man who had stopped pretending that she was not the center of his attention. December became January. Belle's practice, relocated to the east-facing room of the Calloway ranch house, was operational again within 6 weeks of the move. 3 clients had followed her. 2 new ones had found her through the county land office's recommendation, and she was working with the focused efficiency of someone who had found the conditions under which she does her best work. The conditions were a room with eastern light, coffee that was made properly, quiet in the mornings, and the knowledge that the man in the next room or the barn or the fields was not going anywhere. Frank proposed to her in February, in the simplest way imaginable. They were sitting at the kitchen table after dinner, and he set down his coffee and looked at her and said, "I'd like to marry you, if you'll have me." Belle had been expecting it and not expecting it, the way you can both anticipate and be surprised by something you want very much. "Yes," she said. He smiled and his whole face changed, and she had been watching his face for 4 months now, and she never got used to what happened when he smiled. She thought she probably never would. "Good," he said. "I'll ride into Redrock tomorrow and talk to Judge Calloway." "You're efficient," she said. "When I know what I want," he said, "I don't see a point in delay." They were married in March of 1885, in the parlor of the Calloway ranch house, with Lucia and Tomás and Chester, and 2 of Frank's neighboring ranchers as witnesses, and a circuit preacher who came through the territory every 6 weeks performing the ceremony. Belle wore her best dress, a dark blue wool that she had bought in Santa Fe the year before for a particularly important professional meeting, and which she had not expected to wear for any purpose this significant. Frank wore a clean white shirt and a dark vest and had cut his hair, which she noticed, and which she did not tell him she found slightly endearing. The preacher read the vows. Frank said his in the same voice he used for every important thing, even and clear and meaning exactly what it said. Belle said hers looking directly at him, which was the only way she knew how to say things that mattered. Lucia cried. Chester pretended not to. Tomás looked very pleased with himself for reasons that were not entirely clear. They had dinner, and then the witnesses departed, and Lucia went to her quarters, and Frank and Belle stood on the porch in the March evening watching the stars over the red cliffs. And Belle thought about October, about the stage platform in Redrock, and the man with a rifle who had given her a warning that had turned out to be more useful than he intended. And she thought about the boxes of documents on the desk in her room and the letter hidden in the lining that had changed everything. "I was not supposed to find that letter," she said. Frank turned to look at her. "Varner's father hid it. No, I mean, I wasn't supposed to be the one to find it." The county land office could have sent any translator. There were 3 others on their list who handle Spanish land documents. She looked at the cliffs. "I was 3rd on the list. The first 2 were unavailable." Frank was quiet for a moment. "Then I owe those 2 men a debt of gratitude," he said. Belle laughed, the laugh that still surprised her sometimes with how easily it came now. Frank put his arm around her, and she leaned into his side, and the night was very quiet and full of stars and entirely perfect. The spring came early that year, the high desert warming in March in a way that brought color to the ground earlier than usual. Small yellow flowers along the arroyo, the pale green of new growth on the desert scrub. Belle's translation practice grew steadily through the spring, a real estate case in Albuquerque that required a 3-day trip in April, a boundary dispute in Taos that she resolved from the ranch by correspondence, and 2 very detailed annotated document packages. Frank learned to leave the east-facing room door closed before noon, because that was when Belle's concentration was at its highest, and interruption was costly to both of them. They negotiated the rhythms of shared life the way 2 precise and independent people necessarily do, with occasional friction and consistent good faith. Belle had never shared domestic space with a partner before, and she had spent enough years alone to have developed opinions about silence and order, and the management of her own time that were not always compatible with the reality of a working ranch. Frank had spent 5 years running the ranch with only Lucia for domestic company, and he had also developed opinions that required adjustment. They argued once, significantly, about the storage of survey equipment in the east-facing room, which Frank considered a reasonable practical solution, and Belle considered an encroachment on professional space. The argument lasted most of an evening, and was resolved by the construction of a separate storage room off the barn, which actually served Frank's needs better, and which he acknowledged he should have considered before the argument became what it was. Belle told him, after the resolution, that she was aware she was not the easiest person to share space with. Frank said that he was aware he had the tendency to assume his practical solutions applied universally. They looked at each other across this mutual acknowledgement and found it considerably more intimate than many of their easier moments. Elias came to visit in May. Belle had told Frank enough about her brother to constitute a fair warning, and Frank had prepared himself accordingly. Elias arrived on the stage, carrying a new hat he could not have afforded before Belle's intervention, and a carefully assembled air of gratitude that was genuine underneath its slightly practiced surface. He was 26, 8 years younger than Belle, and he had their father's charm without their father's complete absence of conscience, which made him a complicated figure to evaluate. He had genuinely been trying to do better. He had genuinely found himself in a situation that had required rescue. Whether the rescue would take remained to be seen. Frank met him with the same measured directness he brought to everything. He shook Elias' hand, showed him to the guest room, and sat across from him at dinner that first evening with the particular attentiveness of someone taking a fair measurement. Elias, for his part, recognized what Frank was doing and was not offended by it. "You want to know if I'm going to be a problem," he said. "I want to know who you are," Frank said. "Those aren't quite the same question." Elias looked at Belle. "He's very direct," he said. "I know," Belle said. "I find it helps." The visit lasted a week, and it was useful in the way that family visits sometimes are when they go better than expected. Elias helped with the cattle work without being asked, demonstrating a practical competence that suggested he had spent some of the years since the family's dissolution more productively than the debt situation indicated. He and Frank developed a careful but genuine mutual respect over fence work and evening conversations about the economics of the territory. He told Belle on the last morning before the stage that he thought she had done something very right. "The ranch," Belle said. "The man," Elias said. "He looks at you like you're the best discovery he's ever made, and you look at him like you know exactly what you found and you're not going to let it go." He smiled, and in the smile she could see the best version of their father without the worst parts. "I think that's what love is supposed to look like." "Go catch your stage," Belle said, but she was smiling. The summer was full and hot and productive, the ranch cattle moving well, 2 of the water-sharing provisions with the Varner operation working smoothly. Belle's practice adding another regular client through a referral from Addison the lawyer, who had begun sending clients her way for any work that involved Spanish documents. Lucia taught Belle to make properly spiced mole sauce, which required several attempts and one spectacular failure involving too much chili, and Frank pretended the failure batch was delicious and ate 2 portions, which Belle recognized immediately as the kind of honesty exception that love creates. In October, exactly 1 year after Belle had stepped off the stage in Raydrock with her leather satchel and her professional composure and her complete ignorance of what was waiting for her, she stood at the window of the east-facing room in the early morning and watched the light come up over the red cliffs, which was still one of the finest things she had seen in her life, and she knew that she was pregnant. She had known for about 2 weeks, had been careful with herself about it, testing the knowledge from various directions to make sure it was real before she brought it to Frank, which was her habit with information that had significant weight. She had concluded that it was real. She went to find him. He was in the barn with Tamaz, and she waited until Tamaz had gone out with the horses, and then she stood in the barn in the October morning light, and she told Frank the same way she had told him everything for a year, directly and without reduction. He was absolutely still for a moment. And then his face changed in a way she had never seen before, a way that made the smile she loved look reserved by comparison, something that moved through him completely and thoroughly, and he crossed the barn in 3 steps and held her face in both his hands and looked at her. "Are you well?" he said, which was the first thing he said, and Belle felt the love in that, the instinct toward her well-being before anything else. "I'm very well," she said. Then he held her, and the morning light came through the barn siding in long pale bars, and outside the horses moved in the yard, and somewhere Lucia was beginning the morning routine, and the red cliffs stood on the horizon as they had stood for 1,000 years. And Belle thought that this was the specific geography of happiness, not general and not vague, but rooted in an exact place with an exact person who was exactly who he had always said he was. Their son was born in June of 1886 into the summer heat of the ranch, attended by a midwife from Raydrock named Mrs. Cortez, who had delivered half the children in the county. He came into the world loud and determined, which Lucia said was a good sign, and which Belle, who knew something about determination, considered appropriate. They named him James William, James for Frank's grandfather, the one member of his family he had spoken of with uncomplicated warmth, and William for Belle's father, not as an honor but as a reclamation. She had spent years defining herself in opposition to William Kendrick. She was ready to take the name back and make it mean something different. Frank held the baby on the morning of the second day, standing in the east-facing room in the early light, and Belle watched him from the bed where she was still recovering, watched his careful and utter attention to this small new person, and she thought about a man who had once described his father as present in the same room and entirely unreachable. James William Calloway was never going to be able to say that about his father. Belle knew this with the certainty of 12 months of close observation. "He has your eyes," Frank said. "He has your nose," Belle said. "I'm sorry about that." Frank looked up. "What's wrong with my nose?" "Absolutely nothing," Belle said. "He'll be very distinguished." Frank looked back at the baby. "He'll have your brain," he said. "That's more useful than a distinguished nose." "Both would be ideal," Belle said. "Dutch Varner sent a gift, a very good saddle blanket made by a craftsman in Albuquerque, with a card that said congratulations to the Calloways. Frank and Dutch had found, over the course of the year, something that resembled neighborly cordiality without becoming friendship, which was an honest result and a workable one. The water-sharing arrangement had proven beneficial for both operations. The basin, as Dutch had said, was big enough. By the summer of 1887, James was walking, steadily and urgently, in the determined way that Belle had been told was an echo of her own childhood walking style, and Belle's practice had expanded to the point where she was turning away work she could not manage, which meant it was time to consider whether to bring on assistance. She discussed this with Frank, who immediately and without any particular drama suggested that the logical answer was to hire another translator, and that if she needed dedicated office space beyond the east-facing room, he would convert the small building beside the house that currently served as a storage structure. This was so entirely in keeping with his consistent, practical, complete support of her professional life that she sat with it for a moment before answering, because there were still moments when the consistency of it moved her freshly. She hired a young woman named Rosa who had grown up bilingual and had educated herself in legal documents by working for a law office in Albuquerque for 3 years. Rosa was 22, sharp, and deeply ambitious in the way that women who understood their own capabilities and had not yet found room to use them tend to be. Belle recognized this quality immediately and appreciated it as a professional resource and as something more personal. Frank converted the storage building. It had 2 rooms. Belle used the larger one and gave Rosa the smaller one, and the arrangement worked from the first week. In the spring of 1888, Belle realized she was pregnant again. This time she told Frank the same morning she was certain, standing on the porch before the morning work began, because she had understood by now that there was no value in waiting to share important things with this man. He turned from looking at the cliffs and looked at her. "Certain, certain," she said. He reached across the space between them and took her hand. That was all, just her hand in his in the morning before the day began. But it contained everything that needed to be contained. Their daughter was born in November early, which frightened everyone for 2 days before it became clear that she was perfectly healthy and simply impatient, which Belle considered a Kendrick trait and Frank considered a Calloway trait, and which James, at 2 years old, considered an interesting development that occasionally disrupted his routines. They named her Clara after Frank's mother, who had died when Frank was 14, and whose name he had never offered for anything before, which told Belle everything about what it meant to him now. Clara grew quickly. She had Frank's eyes, the gray-green that changed with the light, and Belle's stubbornness, which expressed itself as early as age 1 in a commitment to attempting things she was not yet physically capable of completing. She and James developed the specific antagonistic collaboration of siblings close in age, competing and copying each other in equal measure, filling the house with a kind of noise that neither Frank nor Belle had expected, and that both of them found, to their own mild surprise, utterly indispensable. Lucia had, by this point, transitioned from housekeeper to something closer to the de facto grandmother that she had always been in practice, the center of the household's daily gravity, the person who knew where everything was, and who managed the domestic operations with a calm competence that freed Belle to work and Frank to manage the ranch, and both of them to be present with their children in the hours when presence mattered most. Rosa, who had become essential to the practice by the end of her first year, was talking, in the spring of 1889, about the possibility of eventually starting her own practice in Albuquerque, which Belle encouraged thoroughly and entirely, because one of the things she had learned about having something was that helping others reach it did not diminish it. The Ridge Rock Basin in 1889 was a different place from the Ridge Rock Basin of 1884, not dramatically, not in the way that civic histories mark change, but in the small accumulated ways that matter more. The railroad spur that had been a rumor in 1884 had become an actual line by 1887, and the stage route that had brought Belle to Ridge Rock on that October morning was now supplemented by a train that ran twice a week and made Santa Fe half a day's journey instead of 3 days. This expanded Belle's professional reach considerably and simplified the travel she had always insisted on as a condition of her remaining. Frank never once, in all the years, expressed anything other than full support of her travel for work. He drove her to the station when she went and met her when she came back, and in between he managed 2 children and a cattle ranch and a household with Lucia and Tomás and Chester. And when she came home to a man who had not spent her absence wishing she were different. In the autumn of 1889, exactly 5 years after Belle had stepped off the stage in Ridge Rock with her leather satchel and her professional composure and her complete ignorance of what was waiting for her, she and Frank sat on the porch in the evening as they often did, the cliffs going their extraordinary colors in the last light, the sounds of the children's bedtime routines coming muffled through the walls of the house, the distant, comfortable sounds of the ranch settling into night. 5 years, Frank said. 5 years, Belle said. He was quiet for a moment. Do you regret any of it? She turned to look at him, and she took her time with it, the same care she always took with truth, the same refusal to give any version that was not the accurate one. No, she said, not any part of it. He looked at her the way he had looked at her across the kitchen table in the moment after the last page, the moment that had started everything and contained everything that followed, the look that was honest and clear and not asking her to be anything other than exactly what she was. "I told you a week was all I needed," he said. "You told me a week might resolve everything," she corrected. "And I was right," he said. "You were right," she said. She let the satisfaction of this be visible on her face, which she would not have done 5 years ago, would not have permitted the unguarded acknowledgement, although you could not have known that in advance. "I had a reasonable amount of evidence," Frank said. "The way you translated, the way you handled Varner on the platform, the way you told me about your father." He paused. "The way you argued about the survey equipment." "We are not revisiting the survey equipment," Belle said. "The way you won the survey equipment argument," he continued peacefully, "by being more precise and correct than I was." Belle smiled. The smile that had always surprised her with how easily it came from the first week. "I love you," she said. She had said it before, but she said it now with the weight of 5 years behind it, which was a different kind of weight, not the first discovered weight of feeling, but the long-proven weight of something that had been tested by every ordinary and extraordinary circumstance and had held. Frank looked at the cliffs going dark. "I asked you to stay," he said, "and you gave me everything." "You gave it back," Belle said. The cliffs went from rose to purple to the deep desert blue of early night, and the first stars appeared over them, still extravagant, still more than you could count. And from inside the house, Clara made the sound she made when she was protesting the bedtime routine, a particular three-note complaint that James had learned to imitate with worrying accuracy. And both Frank and Belle looked at the house door, and then at each other with the expression that parents share across the chaos of children they love completely. "Your turn," Frank said. "It is absolutely not my turn," Belle said. "You were inside for the last 2 evenings. I was inside for 1 evening. The other evening you were in Albuquerque." "Being in Albuquerque does not constitute taking a turn," Belle said. "I think the judge would disagree," Frank said. "The judge," Belle said, getting up from her chair, "is not here, and neither argument is resolved. This discussion is not concluded." "I look forward to the conclusion," Frank said. She went inside, and the screen door swung shut behind her, and Frank sat on the porch in the beginning of the night and listened to Belle's voice, which had spent the 5 years since it first crossed his kitchen table, becoming the sound he recognized as the sound of home, talking their daughter down from whatever 3-year-old outrage had required protest, the voice going from firm to gently amused to quietly tender. And he thought about the October day when a woman had stepped off the stage with a leather satchel and told him she was only there to translate the land documents. She had translated everything, the legal language of contested ground into the clear terms of a standing claim. The complicated history of 2 fathers who had made dishonest choices into a story that their children would not have to carry. The silence of a man who had spent his life certain he could manage alone into the full and particular knowledge of what it meant not to be alone. He heard her laugh inside at something Clara had done, and the laugh carried through the walls and into the night air, and it was the same laugh that had come out before she organized it on that first day over the boundary analysis, the laugh that contained everything he had needed to know about who she was. The cliff stood dark against the star-thick sky. The ranch was quiet. The children were settling. Lucia's lamp was a warm square of light at the back of the house. Frank Calloway sat on the porch that was partly built by his father and mostly rebuilt by his own hands over 32 years of work, and he was entirely, unambiguously, in the plain and honest way he had learned to be about every important thing, at peace. Inside, Belle was telling Clara a story. He could hear the cadence of it, the narrator's precision she brought even to bedtime fictions, making them coherent and vivid, giving them the same meticulous attention she gave everything that mattered. Clara was making the quiet sound she made when she was listening, which was how you knew she was finally settling. James had been quiet for 20 minutes, which meant he was already asleep. In a while, Belle would come back to the porch. They would sit together in the dark and talk or not talk, and the stars would wheel overhead in their ancient tracks, and the red cliffs would stand as they had always stood, and the ranch, all 32,000 legal and finally documented acres of it, would be exactly what it had always been underneath all the contested paper and hidden letters and long disputed lines. His. Theirs. Belle came back out. She sat in her chair. She did not say anything for a moment, just looked at the sky. Clara was protesting on principle, she said eventually. Not genuine grievance. I know, Frank said. She's been doing that since March. She's 3, Belle said. Principle is a developmental stage. She gets the principle from you, Frank said. She gets the stubbornness from you, Belle said. We've been through this, Frank said. We have not resolved it, Belle said. Resolution requires evidence, and the evidence is still being gathered. Frank smiled in the dark. We may be gathering it for a while. We have time, Belle said. She reached across the space between their chairs and put her hand in his, and he held it. And the night was full of stars and completely, absolutely, irreversibly whole. This was the life that had been on the last page of the document, waiting there without either of them knowing it, waiting to be translated from potential into everything it had become. Not despite the hidden letters and the dark past, and the forced choice, and the betrayal of fathers who had built dishonest foundations. Because of all of it, because they had both been honest about all of it, because they had looked at the full and complicated truth of where they came from and had chosen each other across all of it, with clear eyes and open hands. Belle Kendrick, who had come to translate the land documents and who had stayed because a man with gray-green eyes had asked her to with 2 plain words, had built the life she had always deserved and had never quite known how to want. And Frank Calloway had built the thing his father never had and had always needed. A home that was a home all the way down to its foundation, held there not by documents or surveys or court decisions, but by the far older and far more binding claim of being loved by someone who chose the truth. Every morning, the light came up over the red cliffs every morning, and they watched it, and it was the finest thing Belle had seen in her life every single time. And it was theirs.